Hello and welcome everyone to episode number 11 of the Multi-Cloud Expedition. Super excited. As always, we have a great show for today. Special thanks to Shannon Waddell as well as Dan Flaherty who helped put this show together. And before we get started, we always like to kind of begin with a level set on the purpose of the Multi-Cloud Expedition. And number one is I talk to a lot of customers in our executive briefing centers as well as on site. And so we get a sense of what their challenges are when it comes to making and optimizing their multi-cloud, or I should say their infrastructure. And one of the big things we've seen over the last several years is the development of a multi-cloud infrastructure. Now, when we say multi-cloud, what do we mean, right? So we begin by saying, and actually you can back up one slide, Shannon. We begin by saying that on the far left-hand side is really your on-prem or your private cloud, right? And that's one component of the multi-cloud. Then it goes all the way out through the hyperscalers, on to sovereign clouds, as well as managed service providers. And all the way to the end, you get out to edge. And this is an important distinction because for the foreseeable future, large enterprises are dealing with this type of a multi-cloud environment. Either they got there themselves through a cloud-first approach or through acquisition. But regardless, customers come talk to us all the time and they say, yes, I've got this kind of many clouds that I am administering in order to run my business. So there's a journey that customers are on. We can jump to the next slide. And that journey for many of them began with cloud first. And then you can see they kind of went first into some of the hyperscalers. And there was a lot of great reasons for doing that. Where they find themselves now, though, is in the midst of all these choices, and that choices has created a lot of complexity. Again, choice isn't necessarily bad, and many times it's good. It gave them more choice for being able to burst capacity or develop with certain native technologies that were only available in the cloud, but they find themselves now in that kind of cloud chaos. So on this show, we like to tackle what's going on in that cloud chaos with customers and bring in subject matter experts to help advise on those different challenges, along with some real tactical advice for a subset of those things. So the goal, right, being able to use and utilize VMware cross-cloud services in order to get to a cloud smart environment, really optimizing that infrastructure. And in fact, that's a big point of today's show is looking at workload placement and how do customers decide where workloads should go in this very complex infrastructure and environment. Okay, now, before we get into the show, let's take a quick look at the past 11 shows, okay, or 10 shows, I should say. This is episode number 11. I'm not going to go through each of these individually. You can grab the QR code there, as well as links to all these will be in the show notes. But one that I wanted to point out in particular is episode number 2, because it ties into today's subject around workload placement. And one of the concepts we'll talk about is understanding what's in your environment. So early on in the multi-cloud expedition, we said, well, one of the key capabilities that operators need to have is knowing the fundamentals of cost and also the observability of what's going on in their environment, what their apps are doing, as well as security. These, of course, key inputs to making decisions about where workloads should actually and applications should reside in the infrastructure. So go back, check out that episode, as well as any other ones that might catch your attention. Now, in today's show, so we can clear that slide off. In today's show, we're going to dive into the workloads, right? And that workload placement. And as I mentioned, there's great flexibility that has come with the multi-cloud, but then that's also created this complexity and the complexity to administer. And in many cases, when that administration gets so complex, then business processes are slowed down. Application development also is slowed down. And what we're hearing customers come and ask us is say, okay, they're living with this multi-cloud infrastructure. And there's also numerous tools. In fact, VMware makes a number of tools that we're going to go through to help them administer it. But bigger kind of business question comes up, which is, how should they decide what to put where? And that's what we're going to kind of tackle today. As always, I like to kind of begin with some high level insights on what customers are facing kind of at the top level. And for this, actually, David Linthicum, the Chief Cloud Strategy Officer over at Deloitte, has joined me on a number of prior shows. And I asked and reached out to him to give us a little bit of insight into the question of what are most enterprise organizations missing when it comes to optimizing their multi-cloud architecture? So let's go ahead and bring David on and to answer that question.
So when thinking about what most enterprise organizations are missing when optimizing their multi-cloud architecture, there's a few very quick answers that come to my mind. Number one would be looking at the applications and workloads themselves, including the data sets, in terms of what can be optimized. In many instances, we have a tendency to want to just change things around the applications and change things around the data. In many cases, that really doesn't fix things. If they're under-optimized themselves, in other words, they're leveraging resources inefficiently, they're not leveraging security properly, they're not leveraging the network communications properly, then you're going to have performance issues and stability issues that you're going to be battling throughout the entire life cycle of that multi-cloud architecture. So this goes down into the applications. We need to understand what they're doing and make sure they're optimized as much as they can be. The other thing would be neglecting the underlying infrastructure. And those are things that we as cloud architects typically forget about. You know, things like the network architecture, things like security systems and other communication mechanisms, power systems in case you're dealing with a data center, things like that. That really is the platform or the tracks that the train's running on. And if those aren't healthy and those aren't doing their job properly, then you're going to find that you're going to have underlying stability issues and performance issues with your multi-cloud architecture. Keep in mind, multi-cloud is a complex distributed system, and the ability to leverage infrastructure to communicate in between the various components is going to be critical to the success of that system. And then finally would be designing systems to be operated would be on the critical path. So keep in mind that it's not just the ability to deploy a system and have it running for that first day. It's the ability to run it over years and times, and the ability to support operations of those systems, and the ability to optimize the operations of those systems. And so we have things at our disposal, such as abstraction and automation capabilities, which allow us to, in essence, mediate some of the complexity. And so we're not dealing with the native systems on the terms of the native systems. We're dealing with the native systems on our terms through abstraction and automation. But you have to build those things into your multi-cloud architecture. You need to build how you're going to operate those systems, how they're going to operate effectively over time. You need to put self-healing capabilities in there, and you need to have the ability for those operations to scale as things change and applications and workloads are added and removed, and we're moving from one cloud to another and different workloads and things like that. So we're really building or optimizing for operations, and we're designing our operational capabilities for change, which is inevitable, as well as growth.
Yeah, thank you, David. David, as always, a great guest and providing great insight into what customers should think about at that right, kind of setting the tone for this conversation about workload placement and choices that need to be made. So from there, a number of great points from David. One around just knowing what you have in order to make that workload placement, and then on to also operationalizing it for the long term. We're going to dive into each of those and get some more kind of understanding of what customers are going through, as well as what recommendations we have. To do that, I want to welcome two subject matter expert guests. One is Matt Webb, Staff Cloud Solutions Architect at VMware. Matt, pleasure to have you here. And
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, the second is Husam Hilal, Senior Partner Solution Architect from Microsoft. Welcome, Husam.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Alexander. Thanks for having us here.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you both here. Before we dive into some of David's insights into the kind of high level, could Matt, why don't we begin with you? Give a quick introduction of your background.
Yeah, so I've been in the IT industry in cloud and infrastructure for close to 13 years now. My current role and responsibility is I help customers adopt Azure VMware Solution, so adopt one of our cloud offerings that happens to be in Azure.
Awesome. And Husam, a quick intro on your side.
Yeah, sure. I'm actually been around is probably the same as Matt, like in the industry for 13 years. In the last few years, I've been focusing specifically on Azure VMware Solution, and as my title says, I'm in the partner organization in Microsoft, focusing on helping partners on Azure VMware Solution.
Awesome. Well, I guess now I have to kind of think about my background, and I think I'm pushing close to 30 years
Wow.
in the IT area. So, oh my gosh, I don't even know if I want to go there. I did start out many years ago in IT at Procter and Gamble, doing their mainframe technology. Wow. So it's come a long way since then into what is now multi-cloud area. Let's reflect a little bit on what David was saying. And one of the points he made at the beginning was around, well, in order to optimize, right, the infrastructure, and maybe we'll back up and say, when we say optimize, right, all of us, we're really saying, getting it's really the most bang for your buck, right, for whatever business objective you're trying to achieve with a specific application or workload, right? And this is a difficult question. So the beginning part is around just trying to figure out, well, what do you have so you can begin to make that choice. So maybe Matt, you can walk us through, figuring out or just talking about that concept of what do you have and what customers are going through.
Yeah. So, it's interesting as I engage with customers, often the questions become more the tactical things of how do I actually move this application, or how do I say stand up Azure VMware Solution or a similar cloud architecture. But they don't really think of like the hard work of exactly what David's talking about in his 3 points. And one of them is untangling that ball of yarn of what is your application? What does it make up? What is business critical? What is critical path? What's not as business critical? Like there's a very big difference between those. And how do I, rationalize those to make a multi-cloud or hybrid cloud journey at the end of the day? One of the tools that we can use for that to at least get started is like Tanzu Transformer. So a lot of VMware customers may realize this technology as like vRealize Network Insight. So it relies a lot on the network, but even with the Tanzu portfolio, more on application dependencies to actually map out your application. Our applications become kind of like that corner in our garage where we kept throwing things in the corner and we're like, I'll get to it later, because we've been focused so much on things like modernization projects. Maybe we have IT refreshes. Maybe we need to upgrade, guest operating systems and AD, like all these mundane things that really keep us, tactical day to day. And then you go to that corner of the garage and you're like, oh my gosh, I've got to completely clean this up. And, I didn't need this thing. I definitely needed this. I've been looking for this for a while. So really that's the critical part and the harder part, because when I sit with customers, what I find is, they want to know, the moves. We have the technology to make the moves, and we have the technology to make them very simple. But the hard work still needs to be done around that first point of, understanding your application.
Yeah, I also emphasize that point, Matt, as well. I think understanding the application dependency mapping, using those tools from VMware, the ARIA tools and the Tanzu as well, as you mentioned here, actually really helps to figure out what the application groups looks like. If you want to do like actual migration, you want to move those applications from one side to another, you want to make sure you're moving the whole set together and not basically leave one behind that maybe can cause the application not to run at all, or maybe just kind of cause some performance issues as well. So understanding the dependency mapping of the application is really crucial into any kind of cloud migration, especially to your topics, Alexander, here about the placement of those workloads. So we're looking at where we're going to place those workloads, but also we need to understand what are our workloads first before we actually go anywhere.
Yeah, it's interesting, having had David on a number of different times. He's mentioned this point over and over again, and the point of, instead of doing the, ready, aim, fire, it seems more like it's fire, ready, aim when it comes to, taking infrastructure and putting it somewhere, right?
Mhm.
And Matt, you mentioned at the beginning, which is all of a sudden they just take, and I love your analogy of the, the pile in the garage, right? They take that pile in the garage and they move it essentially from one garage to another. And then they wonder why it's still running just as, it's costing more or the same, or it didn't achieve what they thought they were going to achieve. because that hard work didn't get put in. So I think for our viewers, this number one point is you got to put in that kind of due diligence work to understand what's going on in your environment, right?
Yeah, definitely. And sometimes, that's reaching across the aisle to the application developers and, having those we often do in these migration or mobility groups that we're standing up is those interviews, like going through all of it. And that's why we mentioned Tanzu Transformer is, it is not uncommon to engage with these application owners and they just don't know, or they have limited information. Or they can just add context to what we find in Tanzu Transformer. So really there are tools that give us some technical advantages, but it is still very operational heavy of being able to work with them as the application owners and all these other groups.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, foundationally, that just knowing what you have is super important, and it leads to then I think our point number 2, and this is a great discussion we had in preparation for this show, which is okay if you've done point 1, which is just knowing what you have, then point number 2 is literally, I guess, as important, and this is defining what good looks like. And that what good looks like is what does it look like, right, from whatever that business objective is that you're trying to achieve, whether it's performance or cost or privacy. And so, Matt, you brought this up, and maybe you can chime in on what you've seen and for what do we mean when we say what does good look like?
Yeah. Again, David said all the critical points. He's speaking my language as being a staff cloud solutions architect. This is another hard one. What does good look like for an application? Oftentimes what I find is when customers start thinking about, security and compliance, there are a lot of tactical things we can look at to make sure we can meet security and compliance goals. And then it becomes, what about performance, for an application? And the challenge with performance is as infrastructure people, we tend to go to these, benchmarking tools that really don't show any business advantage or business outcome. So like I'm a storage guy. I often, when I come into customers to help my peers with customers that may have storage questions, they're running things like FIO or VD bench or HCI bench or iometer. Those are great to understand IO and capabilities of the storage, but what does your application actually need? Because you run those in different ways. Like a lot of people focus on IOPS, and really throughput could be a bigger concern for the database job that may be running for hours. So, understanding what good looks like is important. I'll give you a great example of one I came across. And this actually was during the holidays last year. I had a customer, they had a very large registration system, very, very large application, had lots of dependencies, and they were moving it to Azure, and specifically on the AVS platform, Azure VMware Solution. They moved it up, and it was a 2.5 times slower. What is going on? We know that this technology is modern. We know it's capable. Let's start peeling back the layers of the onion. And what helped us do it is first the customer understand what good looked like, to understand it was 2.5 times slower. What they did is they built an application of its own that benchmarks their application as a whole. How long does it take for a user to register for this, calendar invite, or register for this thing, or get their hours in? Like all of those different things had different metrics that we were able to track. And then we use Transformer to go and look at, okay, now we can see what it looks like on-prem. What does it look like here? And we could start finding the bottlenecks, and it ended up being a load balancer configuration at the end of the day and where it was placed. So it wasn't on-prem, it was in like a VNet, and we brought it closer to the virtual machines. And not only did we get better to the same performance, we actually did better performance wise. But again, it was the combination of the customer did their homework. They knew what good looked like for their application. They actually operationalized what good looked like. And then we used the technical tools that we had at our disposal to identify these issues.
Yeah, this is, it's interesting to me as I tie together a number of different episodes of the point you're making around defining what good looks like, right? And then measuring it and tying it to a business objective is in many ways a textbook example of where IT becomes a competitive differentiator, right? And that is a very, a great place to operate from in a company, because by all means, anything that any piece of work, almost any piece of work that needs to get done typically goes through some IT system in order to have that work done, right?
Mhm.
And so IT can either be just, it is what it is, right? They just, we moved this over here. We were told to put it in the cloud and now we've done it. Or it becomes a, hey, we know what the business is looking for. We understand that piece of it. And we want to deliver a competitive solution that makes us more efficient, saves money, faster, more orders, you name it. So this is, I guess, another more of an emphasis on understanding what that good looks like, and then even tying it to that, and ideally what good looks like ties to a business objective, because then you're really in lockstep with the business needs.
Yeah, and one more note on that. I'm so glad you bring up the competitive advantage, because sometimes people just think of like their industry competitors. Sometimes it's just competing to keep their employees. Like for this system, 2 or 2.5 times slower for an employee to register for what they need to do day to day. That affects keeping people, and we all know right now it's hard to keep people. There's so many open jobs, and it's a very competitive market. So it's again, IT, really enabling the business to keep people in, differentiate themselves on the market.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I can also maybe add here a tool that maybe helps customers and partners define even what that good looks like. I mean, for example, from an architect lingo, I mean, if you think about the well-architected framework like WAF, this actually is a good tool to help eventually customer figure out how things going to look like from a security perspective, reliability perspective, performance perspective, cost perspective when I'm going, for example, into the cloud. And I know, for example, VMware, let's say, have their own WAF, documentation for, let's say, AVS. We also have the same one from Microsoft as well. So kind of getting the best from both worlds would be great fit to defining what that good looks like. I think also David kind of pointed to that indirectly by talking about the kind of the complexity of operation. I think you also, Alexander, mentioned that in the cloud chaos phase, right? This also could be all like mapped all together. I think part of the pain here is not just, as David mentioned, just like moving things into the cloud, into Azure for specifically. It's just also how you want to operationalize that to make it run for a long term without having much of pain for managing it. So it starts with the plumbing for sure. I think Matt brought a great point here about networking, right? So I think especially in AVS, and the way it is right now, one of the main challenges for starting with it is the networking. It's a little bit kind of a large like learning curve for the customer to start with. But once they kind of finalize that, I think their next step is to figure out the operations part. And then if they're consistent with that, I think they can be happy, moving forward with that system.
Yeah, and it's a great segue to some key considerations. And wait, before you bring up the slides, Shannon, it would be, I'd say, it would be disingenuous for us to say there's a one size fits all to this particular workload placement, because every organization, unfortunately, I'd say certainly anyone of size is a snowflake, right? It's got legacy technologies, it's got new technologies, it's got inherited technologies, it's got prior policies and procedures. And so all of those make for a whole lot of snowflakes. Now, together, we can kind of give guidance about some big bucket considerations. To say there's a perfect formula for it would be, we're not there yet, right?
Mm-hmm.
Multi-cloud is still relatively new, right? Even hyperscalers, I should say, operating for a large enterprise at scale is somewhat new. Keep in mind, when I say operating, I mean, if you look at VMware's been around for 25 years. So there's a super long operating history, expertise, all of that. Amongst hyperscalers, right? Many companies are still figuring out the most efficient way to use it. It doesn't mean that they're not doing amazing things, but how do they optimize that for the business? So let's pop up the slide and let's start to kind of give guidance to our audience about some of the big buckets that they should think about when someone is saying, hey, let's make things more efficient or optimize, or even if we need to move to this area or that area. So let's start out with cost, compute, network, storage, operating system, licenses, database. There's a lot in that bucket. Maybe Husam, kind of start with you, and if you have kind of guidance on what you've come across customers and their experiences in this area.
Yeah, I mean, all the point that is basically in that green box it makes me think of responsibility matrix for like running any VMware Cloud offering in the cloud versus on premises, right? So this is kind of the question for me there, because a lot of these, for example, the cost, for example, for operations, for licenses, for that is part of what the provider provides, right? So the customer doesn't really have to worry about it. If we think about the overall cost for like operation, it's going to be eventually less because at this point, customer doesn't have to worry about hardware maintenance, licenses upgrades from a VMware perspective, even power and other things that kind of they have to pay for, like data center leases as well. This is basically out of the equation. The cost they pay basically is for the service, and the service probably entails, compute and network and storage as well. All that in one together. And for example, I can give here about the operating system, like for example, benefits customers can get when they move into like cloud, specific like AVS. We have the hybrid benefits with Azure, allowing the customer to bring their existing on-premises Windows and SQL licenses into Azure, right, into AVS specifically, and without to have to pay additional licensing costs. As well, something we exclusively have in AVS, which is the ability to provide free extended security updates for the kind of the software, like for Windows and SQL that went into live. This is very exclusive into AVS. So the trend that I see here, that eventually customer would, for example, pick AVS for those reasons, right? Because they have less responsibility to focus on. They get some of the benefits that the Azure, for example, provider provides here from a Windows and SQL side of the house. So I think that's one of the things that we need to kind of look at. And then we can talk more later, I guess, about the modernization for databases and stuff like that, and how they can basically fit into existing systems without a lot of refactoring or remodeling for the application to make it work in a best optimized cost perspective for those kind of storage extensive workloads.
Yeah, and for that green box here, and actually for all of these boxes, all of these do tie back to what does good look like, right? And probably for the green box, it might be a little bit more intuitive because the first word there is cost. So it's like, okay, good looks like saving X amount, right? It's not always that simple, but that's kind of at least one consideration. Let's move to the next box and talk about the business demands for agility and modernization. And maybe Matt, you can share your thoughts on that and what good looks like.
Yeah, I mean, I think in this box, it reminds me of what David mentioned of like, have you been, optimizing your systems, really the infrastructure at the first place? Have you even modernized? Like sometimes we're working with customers. We went through the past 10 years and for some customers still happening of a true modernization of like, finally, some people are finally truly getting off physical boxes or some of these things that you think are kind of old school way of thinking. So we had about a decade of true modernization, and that goes for every component. That could be network and virtualization of the network. That could be virtualization of storage. That could be automation and operational changes. And so I think more than anything, you need to ask yourself, have we modernized yet? Because if we, this is like a crawl, walk, run. We go from crawl to run, you're going to stub your toes. It's going to happen. So I think as you're talking about your agility and modernization, where are we at? Like, have we already modernized or have we not? Can we consider ourselves modern? Because if you've kind of skipped what we've been doing the last decade in IT, going to cloud is going to be hard. It's not that it's not doable. It's that it's going to be that much more of a lift.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the next box over, privacy, security, and compliance, feels like it should just be a layup for consideration. And when I say layup, I mean, if you know the applications and the data and what the requirements are, then it should be pretty easy to prioritize that into where that workload should go. However, there has been the case, right, where this hasn't been thought through about what are the privacy, security, and compliance needs. And then folks have done the fire ready aim philosophy. And when I say philosophy, I'd say it's more of like a possible situation they were pushed into and wound up with challenges where they had to perhaps repatriate workloads or move them to someplace else. So that one's an interesting one. But again, we put up there for customers to be aware of it. Hopefully they don't get themselves in that situation, but an easy one to kind of eval. I'll skip to the next one and we'll go, because it's kind of related, visibility and governance of enterprise assets. And we'll go back to Husam if you want to kind of share your thoughts on that one.
Yeah, I think this is basically the point that we talked about before, about the visibility of the operations, right? I mean, across all the workloads, regardless where they are, or on premises or in cloud or whatever they are. Basically, that is a really important thing that we need to focus on. I mean, I know, for example, VMware, and they have the Area Suite. For example, in Azure, we have Azure Arc that also helps bring that visibility. And maybe we can combine those tools together to get the best of both of them. But the point here is that eventually customers need to have a full visibility to be able to monitor their environment, to monitor their assets from a single place. Because operation, if it's complex, it's going to be kind of a nightmare for managing this multi-cloud, which is sometimes is necessary, right? But it's sometimes unavoidable situation where you really need to find a solution to be kind of see all of your workloads, regardless where they are, from a single location, monitor them. So that's also, I think David pointed to that from the operation perspective, how we can make the workloads run fine for a long period of time. And if also the technology keeps evolving, so you cannot even think of 10 years, because at next 5 years and maybe less, we will probably have more tools. We'll have a robust way of looking at things here. The last point I want to mention also about this is how you govern your infrastructure. I want to technically talk about the infrastructure as a code approach. I think this is a nice approach that the customers, not a nice, I think a must-have approach for all the deployments, to have the ability to repetitively deploy the workloads on any platform and be consistent with your operation and deployment model as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that visibility and governance, again, these are things that could be taken for granted when there's not a pause to do the due diligence on where the workload should wind up, and then all of a sudden finding out that a governance requirement for reporting cannot be met in a different environment than one was used to. So again, we're trying to share some of the the horror stories that we've heard, right? Where it's like, oh, everything will just work great, right? And not to throw shade in any direction of a salesperson, but sometimes sales and marketing slides might overpromise perhaps on every single capability, because the existing infrastructure is a super complex environment. So going back to defining what good looks like.
What are you talking? That never happens. It's never oversimplified, right? No, I think the last comment I'd make to around the visibility and governance is that's been part of that modernization journey. And that's kind of what you have to think of when you're moving into the multi-cloud world, because at the end of the day, I mean, this is an oversimplification, but it's a good bit of guidance, is you're building sort of data centers in these clouds, right? So visibility around logging, or governance around backup policy, things of those nature sometimes gets lost because you didn't ask yourself, when I modernize, what were some of the big upgrades that I did over time that I need to have as a requirement moving into a new cloud, right? What do I absolutely require that I've already built? And sometimes that may be identical to what you do. Microsoft is a great partner when it comes to working with a great ecosystem, just like we are. 25 years of working on private clouds. We work with a wide range of vendors that do a wide range of things for customers. So making sure that you're having that idea in your head of what are my requirements as maybe an infrastructure person as I move in, that go on top of the business requirements, and how to make them all match.
Mm-hmm. And these different considerations, I guess there's always two philosophical approaches to it. There's certainly the pragmatic, trying to look at everything and then make good choices about it. But one doesn't want to necessarily fall in the paralysis by analysis. So for the audience out there, hey, this is not easy. You got to figure out the right balance. And sometimes that balance might be, go fast, and some things will break. As we're talking and about the visibility or certain needs for reporting, et cetera, there's also cases where customers move fast, things break, and they find out, what, we didn't need all that, all this extra garbage that was taking up resources and time. So, that can be a positive upside. I don't know that I'd bet in that direction always. Yeah. So it's good to probably have a balance, maybe the 80% of information and then go for it. but probably not good to just jump off with a 20% information on what's going on.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Matt. Did you gonna say
No,
something?
that's call for leadership, right? Leadership around understanding there's going to be mistakes, and there's good mistakes and there's bad mistakes, right? I think this is something that's been thought of a lot of CEOs of. We want to move fast and break things. There are things that we shouldn't break because we're already operationally sound, but there's things that we're doing to improve the business, and there will be growing pains. And so allowing your people to have sort of the space to make those mistakes is sometimes they don't get that. So as a leader, if you're watching this, just keep that in mind, that we need to give some room for what we would refer to as good mistakes as they go through this journey.
Yeah, that's a great, excellent point. Let's almost round it out, because we still got the orange box on the bottom, but performance for optimal customer experience. And Matt, I'll kind of give this one to you for your kind of insights on what you see.
Yeah, I mean, this is a perfect, the story I gave about the way that they stressed an application. We're moving on from infrastructure and focusing on business solutions, like business outcomes. And so when you think about what business outcomes I want, you need to think of it from a holistic level, not just I ran this tool that said that the CPU performance is 20% better than the platform I had before. Because the reality is that that is a very small number in a very vast world. And so you need to find a way to collect and understand the application, understand your infrastructure requirements and needs, and then try to put them in a way of how do I know what good looks like? Because sometimes it won't be the same, but it's good enough and you got all these advantages. Sometimes it'll be massively better, and it makes very little difference to the business. And so you have to kind of balance all of these. We acknowledge it's not easy, but those are really critical to make good business decisions.
Yeah, the last one there on the bottom, we put this in there for for good measure, because many of our audience members are faced with this big orange box that goes all the way across all these, which is just the new boss in town says, nope, we're going to do it this way. And of course, there's a certain amount of obviously wanting to do good work, right? And where our audience members are faced with this, and you've got the space to maybe push back a little bit in terms of consideration, highly recommend that those boxes at least be talked about. Like, hey, this is great. Can we at least evaluate some of this mandate along these dimensions? Because at the end of the day, evaluating it on those dimensions and defining what good looks like will end up having a better business outcome than just, okay, no, with very little information, let's just go pick this or pick that and everything will be great. Because it usually nobody's system is that simplified that will work, at least in my experience. Yeah,
100%. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, we went out and polled our users on some of this, and so let's bring up the next slide. And so on LinkedIn, we ran a poll. We were only given 4 options. So although we had multiple boxes on the prior slide, LinkedIn limits us to just 4 choices. And it was interesting to see with 1,500 of our followers voting that security and compliance actually came up as the number 1 concern. It really outweighed the others. I don't know if we run a number of polls, and I typically don't see things weighted this much in one direction. But the question we asked there was, what is the most important factor when deciding where to deploy your workloads, public, hybrid, or private cloud? And again, number 1, privacy, security, and compliance. So maybe I'll go back to Husam, start with you. And why are our users or our customers thinking that that's the highest, important piece?
Yeah, it's very kind of shocking and surprising to me to see kind of this focus here on privacy and compliance, but it might actually be not. I think there's 2 ways for me, at least, to look at this, reason here, or why we have this fact about the privacy, security, compliance. I guess maybe for the first reason is customer might just be more comfortable with what they have today with like on premises. Like I know like my stuff, I know how to control it, I know how to monitor it. Like I'm so kind of happy with what I have from a privacy perspective, right? And I guess for me from a compliance perspective, because they have been working for years to achieve whatever like they have from a compliance requirement side of the house. Same as for security. The other part is, I guess, the other reason could be is a customer lack for knowledge about what we have in the cloud, right? So some of them like are basically hesitant about the whole concept of the cloud. Like, what do you mean by like, going to put my data in somewhere else? Like, I don't, it's like putting my money, like, and giving it to my neighbor. Like, it doesn't like make sense. I want to keep my money in my house. So, or in my bank account, technically. So basically, I think that's kind of the knowledge perspective that maybe what we need to kind of build here is, educate customers further to understand how private a cloud can be as private and as, meeting all the compliance requirement, sometimes even better than at on-premises. And I didn't talk much about security yet, but I'm going to also say that it's also part of that learning curve for the customer to understand that clouds brings a lot of security tooling, and it helps actually them to provide like a nice, a security posture for their workloads, even sometimes more than on premises. And keep in mind that, as I mentioned before, about responsibility matrix on like the cloud offering for VMware versus like what customers might have on premises, is the responsibility matrix is who's managing the compliance and the privacy and stuff. I mean, this at that point is the responsibility of the cloud provider. For example, in AVS, this is responsibility of Microsoft. So at that point, customer doesn't really have to worry about their privacy and compliance, because this is something, managed by Microsoft. They can just basically, and even security as well, they can just focus more on their workloads specifically, but not as a whole, like, hypervisor, level of things here for private security compliance. But yeah.
Matt, your thoughts on some of these poll results?
Yeah, to Husam's note, it's surprising and not surprising all the same. I mean, with the recent news of the MGM hack, I mean, security is top of mind for everyone. I mean, I know, when I talk to my peers in the industry, it's what keeps them up at night. These attacks can be sophisticated, and not sophisticated is a thing that's just mind blowing. They can be extremely technical and just simple social engineering. And so it makes sense. I think privacy is becoming, more of something when you have very sensitive intellectual property, and there's a concern about, where do I place that? And I think it's a good conversation to be thinking about. But I think that's also why, when bundled in these three things, is at the top of the list. And then there is, like I've mentioned before, during modernization for, things like logging and SIMs, and being able to just have visibility into my infrastructure and monitor my infrastructure and look for places that attackers are trying to get in, or maybe I'm trying to do micro segmentation. All these things are you can do in any cloud at the end of the day. It's just, it might slightly change. And so this is I think comforting to me as as an advisor, that customers are thinking about this, because these should be the first questions when you go and evaluate multi-cloud or hybrid cloud. How do I do all these things that I have been modernizing for the last decade? How do I do things like logging and backup, and correct controls through RBAC, and integration into vCenter, things, all disaster recovery, ransomware, obviously another a big idea. How do I optimize if I do get compromised, and suddenly all my stuff is encrypted and amassed for a ransom? So again, surprising and not surprising. I think for me and Husam, it always seems performance and tactical things seem to be the first questions. But I mean, these are the things that matter the most, is this top one: privacy, security, and compliance.
Yeah, as well, like, as the cost. I mean, I was also kind of expecting the cost would be like the number one reason there, but it wasn't. And also, we have like 2%. I think this is still like important. Maybe people kind of maybe have overlooked this portion. I think in real world, let's just be realistic here. Sometime when I have a new workload, or maybe say just want to expand, I just don't have enough capacity in my like existing environment. So I really have to make a decision, maybe getting out of my comfort zone, right? Maybe my comfort zone is to stay on premises, but I don't really have enough hardware. Like I just ordered like a new fleet of servers, but I don't really have them. So how I'm going to expand? I really have to pick up a different option at this point. So maybe that falls under that 2%. I don't know, but I guess this is in a way that cloud expansion. The kind of the more challenging, the economical situation where things getting more expensive, I guess, from a cost perspective, for getting additional hardware and maintaining it. This might be other reasons why where customers would just go into like a cloud provider, for example, to manage that part for them, to manage the hardware and all this, the life cycle for the essential workloads to run in the cloud. So again, maybe this is part of the 2%. I don't know, but as Alexander mentioned, we didn't have enough space here to put all the other options as well.
Yeah, and it's worth actually me reminding the audience we are talking live here, and so if you have questions or you want to comment on this poll in particular, you can just drop them in the comments, especially questions, because at the end of the show we'll have both Matt and Husam on to answer questions that come up throughout this episode. As I kind of look at this, I'm thinking to myself, boy, the privacy and security, it definitely feels like this might be the, I want to say the comfort level, right, of existing infrastructure folks saying that, well, number one, like this is my biggest concern because it's such an unknown. It's so difficult to specifically quantify a security breach, right? And so how much is it worth it from a cost standpoint, to make it up $1 million if the risk is asymmetrical, to lose $2 billion in net worth. So I can kind of understand it. I think the interesting takeaway for the audience should be, if I kind of go up to some of the senior leadership that might be watching, is if there's let's say optimization, modernization efforts that are being slowed, you might have to take a look at, well, what are your privacy, security, and compliance policies? Because underneath the covers, maybe a lot of that is actually slowing things down. And as Husam said, well, sometimes it may actually be better in a different environment. Those can be improved. So check through those boxes to see before just kind of, things slowing down there. So, all right, we're going to keep moving on. We're going to talk about the last point that David made, because this kind of also helps bring things together, which is when thinking about that workload placement, an important key consideration is designing for that long term. So he made that point. And the way that we kind of think about that and designing for that long term means moving out of the technology silos. So when we say move out of technology silos, what are we talking about, Matt? You kick us off.
Yeah, I think cloud in general is asking a lot of individual contributors to branch out. You may have just been the VI admin, or you may just have been the networking guy, but now your worlds are colliding. It's getting much closer. It's no longer I just put a ticket in. I need to collaborate with the networking team, or maybe I need to take on more responsibility of understanding how networking works because I'm going to be reaching in and doing some networking things. There's always in IT, we have to get comfortable being uncomfortable. I deal with this every year when I even look, if you look at, just go look at job hunt, even if you're not looking right now, the skills they are asking for are dramatically different than just even 2 years ago. And that gives you an idea of, you need to start branching out to these areas. You don't need to be an expert. Matter of fact, they're not even looking for experts. They're looking for people that just really understand the world around them and how they bring it in to solve business challenges. And so we see this all the time when we have adoption processes that go for maybe Azure VMware Solution. It's never going to be identical to what you did on-prem. We can always achieve the same outcomes, but there's going to be a little bit of, I'm working with my peers of, okay, this is a new tool, who operationally owns it? How do we collaborate around it? How do we make it work for us, right? And sometimes it can make your life easier. Sometimes it adds a little bit. It just depends on the situation. So you have to be prepared that, being multi-cloud ready or hybrid cloud ready or just cloud ready is going to require a little bit more from everyone.
On this one, it kind of reminds me of in my days in end user computing, where there was the desktop world, right? And the administrators of the desktop world. Then there was this little funny thing called the BlackBerry Enterprise Server, the BES server, right? Mm-hmm. And the BES server pretty much handled mobile devices, the BlackBerries. And it was its own little thing, never to touch or unite with the desktop people. Then the BlackBerry Enterprise Server turned into mobile device management, right? Then the iPhones came in, the iPads, then all these things. And then before you knew it, really the desktop, so to speak, began to be ubiquitous between a laptop, iPad, whatever it may be, a Microsoft Surface, etc. And so the ones that were on that, on that edge, at least knew kind of what was going on around them, were much better suited to then tackle that challenge than the ones who said, nope, desktop world, we're always going to stay in the desktop world. This other thing is just a sideshow, right? This is not, I remember when people said, nope, iPads will never come into the enterprise, right? iPhones will never come into the enterprise. That's a consumer device. That is not a enterprise device. Well, multi-cloud means you got to kind of know not only your on-prem stuff, but have that awareness of what's available. Because how can you do that workload placement if you don't even know how the network would connect to a hyperscaler or to another sovereign cloud or something of that nature? So I don't know, Husam, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I want to maybe just maybe comment a little bit about what kind of Matt brought on there about the kind of the skill set perspective, right? So I think there's also some good news here, right? We should probably share with everyone that whenever you're using like a VMware Cloud offering in the cloud, AVS, for example, those admins can at least start with their existing skills because it's a consistent skill set from what they have on premises and what they have in the cloud. So they can still like manage vSphere, manage vCenter the same way they do it on premises. If they have like any Power CLI code or Terraform code, they might still like use that against their AVS private cloud. That's the good news. And then the other part of it is also they can organically start learning more about the cloud, right? So you can learn more about like cloud native services or cloud native VMs, for example, and then they can basically, when they feel that level of confidence, put kind of things together, and they can see what's optimal for them. Is like what can I keep on AVS, what I can move into like the native services or Azure infrastructure, and similar to other cloud providers. I'm just giving Azure here as an example, but that's going to be on the good news side of the house. So today you don't have to go and start studying really hard to kind of be too much worried. I mean, you eventually have to get outside of your comfort zone. That's, I think, is no question with that. But the good news that we're kind of giving kind of customers kind of a gradual way of moving in that ladder is like, you don't have to basically jump from step 1 to step 10. We can organically learn and grow with your skill set to get into like a multi-cloud understanding, how we can operationalize things and run them in multi-cloud operation.
Yeah, Husam's really doing good at pulling me back in because I like to focus on the challenges because they're always so interesting. These big challenges that all organizations are faced with. But yeah, Husam and I also work on Azure VMware Solution, and the analogy I like to give is like when you're moving and adopting to cloud like this, at least when you're moving to something like a VMware platform in Azure, like AVS, it's sort of like think of what it's like moving, in general. If you're moving to another country, that is a huge move. Not only do you have to pack up all your stuff, which is a huge pain and a reason why I never want to move again, you have to, register everything in that new country. You're looking at a new driver's license. You're looking at new citizenship. You're potentially looking at a different language. That is a huge challenge. Now take that into, I'm just moving to another state, or I'm just moving down the road in the same country. That's sort of like what people feel with these VMware solutions in the cloud is they're moving. And even though that's still hard, there's still, hard things about it. It's a lot easier to adopt because I didn't have to do things that would go along with the analogy of like a brand new ecosystem of what I have to work with. And literally everything is changing down to the basic language of how I communicate. I keep a lot of the things the same, slight things tweak. And now I have more enablement to all these other cloud services that I wanted to do. So it's been a huge advantage.
Yeah, great analogy. I hadn't heard that one before, but it makes a lot of sense the way you explained it. The registering in a new country versus just kind of moving to another state. So that's super useful.
Even like learning the new language, I think is also is a good analogy here because like once you move to the cloud, I mean, sometimes you don't even know the cloud APIs or how to work with them. So I think to me that's kind of the new language really fits perfectly with that example. Yeah, perfect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. Matt, with that, I'm going to bid you adieu for a little bit. And then Husam and I are going to focus on infrastructure as a service and public cloud platform as a service. But we'll bring you back for the questions and the final points. So thank you so far.
Yeah.
All right, Husam, let's go ahead and bring up another visual aid. around the different options in a multi-cloud infrastructure, because I guess this is forever our future, right? Which is there's going to be a lot of options, which means complexity, different tools, and so as we think about that, maybe you can help us understand, as you've talked to customers, why they might want to do hybrid cloud, right? Kind of infrastructure as a service. We'll start there, then we'll move into platform as a service.
Sure. Yeah, definitely. So this is basically like for multiple reasons, I think, and we can focus here on the flexibility part of it. I mean, what they can gain with this is the flexibility with the hybrid cloud is they can decide what's better to run. And this is, again, the topic of this conversation today is where they can best, have their workloads running. Maybe some of that workloads have to stay on premises for some reason we can discuss later. And maybe that workload can live better in the cloud. So having that flexibility, this is one of the reasons that what the hybrid cloud provides here. And then like we have some tools from VMware, for example, HCX can help that actually dream become a reality. It's a nice mobility tool that can help like moving workloads back and forth, regardless where you're moving them, from on-premises to cloud, from cloud provider 1 to cloud provider 2, across the cloud providers. So it's a really nice way to kind of keep the workloads moving. And so again, we can see reasons why this is happening. I mean, some of it, as we discussed before, the cost, the privacy, the modernization, for example. I think that's a big factor when I basically double click on is a lot of, the customer has a mandate to basically for their digital transformation. Like I really have to modernize my workloads. I have a mandate to move to the cloud. So, having multiple applications and eventually in the reality, that's what the customers have, moving them and modernizing them into like cloud native services is almost like impossible. And if it's possible, it is technically possible, but it will take a lot of time. It's not scalable. It moves very slow. A lot of challenges because moving into cloud like native services at some point, it's not compatible what the customer have today. Like it's a new storage services, it's a new networking services that those applications are not designed to live in that kind of host. But then eventually with the VMware solutions in the cloud, like with AVS, for example, that can be like their first step, at least, so they can move things as is, right? So they don't have to worry about refactoring, re-architecting those applications and moving them into the cloud.
It's
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say it's that rapid and low risk migration, right? Kind of what
Exactly.
Matt just mentioned in the analogy, being able to say, okay, we're just going to move to another state, right? That's kind of that hybrid idea. You got to move something. You want to keep most of it the same, right? Low learning curve. And ideally you're getting, well, there could be different reasons. You might have to evacuate a data center, right? It would be one example that's pretty common, but hybrid cloud can be perfect for that. The other one, though, also very interesting, is when to choose platform as a service. So maybe you can kind of talk us through that part of it, and we can the visual we don't need anymore for the platform as a service.
Sure. Yeah, I think this is a great question, Alexander. So, I mean, it's possible, right? I mean, customers can really start leveraging platform as a service today, but it's not as easy, right? There's a lot of, application kind of refactoring that has to happen because those applications are designed to run like in a fully managed environment, or maybe designed to run on a VM somewhere maybe on premises. So if you want to jump directly, and again, we talked before, I think Matt brought this up about the crawl, walk, run approach. I mean, you cannot jump from the crawl to the run directly. You have to walk first. So that's what we're talking about. We eventually can go into the PaaS services in the cloud, maybe leveraging Azure PaaS for this example here, but it's probably more realistic if we, as you said, migrating to the cloud with VMware Solutions is the most rapid, least risky migration, right? So you can move things as is. So that's kind of the recommendation we kind of guide our customers with. Move as is into AVS, or maybe expand as is to AVS, because they might just want to stay hybrid, right? They might just want to be on both sides. And then from there, at your short-term goal is to basically see what workloads can be integrated with Azure services. Think of, for example, like a database. Like if you have a SQL database, Azure has a lot of Azure managed SQL databases services. So if you leverage any of those, you can basically move that database from AVS, let's say in this case, into Azure database service. And what you gain with that is basically you gain, performance, operation, even cost consideration, because I talked before also about the WAF, the Workload framework, where you can like reassess your infrastructure today and see how you can optimize. So for that example, you might save some costs with it, with just basically shrinking the number of AVS nodes you're using. You might using, let's say, 60 today. If you move, let's see, your databases, if you move your file shares into things like, for example, Azure Files or Azure NetApp File, for example. These are great solutions we have in Azure managed environments that if you free up that space from the AVS side, you will also optimize on cost. I'm not also talking about operation, not talking about the management kind of pain that you will probably relieve your team from, because this will become a managed service in the cloud. They will just focus more on the innovation, more just focusing on the kind of basic operation things to keep things up.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good explanation. And it's probably a good segue to the demonstration that we have, which is kind of a tactical demonstration of after the choice has been made to leverage a platform as a service capability. Well, here's a great kind of tactical example of how one would achieve that. So let's go ahead and we can roll that demo.
Perfect.
Let's copy the SQL managed instance host name from the Azure portal, and then go to a VM running on Azure VMware Solution and do DNS resolution. You can see I get a private IP address here, leveraging private endpoint feature in Azure. Now on Azure Data Studio, I will connect to that SQL managed instance privately. You can see I only have the system databases. Now this is my application to the website running on IIS on Windows Server. Looking at the connection string is pointing to a local database running internally on the server. Once I browse to it, I can see 3 tasks already entered in this to-do application. Next thing, what I'm trying to do here is to migrate the database of this application from the local SQL and move it into SQL managed instances. I can see here the to-do DB that I want to migrate. Now going to the Azure SQL migration extension of Azure Data Studio, I can click on Migrate to Azure SQL, providing the parameters here and clicking on Start Migration. Once the migration is done successfully, you can see the to-do database has been moved into Azure SQL Managed Instance, with the 3 tasks already being part of that database. And now the most important part here, which is to update the connection string pointing to Azure SQL Managed Instances. Now if I browse the application, you'll see I have the 3 tasks ready there. I'm going to try to create a new one just to verify here. I have now my task number 4. And if I go back to my table in the migrated DB, I can see there's a new row being added there for task 4.
Yeah. So this is basically kind of the point for this demo, Alexander, is to show basically how easy it is for modernizing like an application. So now the application is no longer using a SQL running on AVS, it's using the SQL managed instance in Azure. So, and they didn't have to do any refactoring for the application. The only thing we have changed is the connection string. And there's even a better use cases for SQL. There's a feature actually in SQL Server 2022, I guess. It's called Link with SQL Managed Instance. So they can actually use the SQL Managed Instance as the replication. So basically they can replicate data and they can do the cutover just basically with no downtime at all if they just configure their DNS properly. So it's very nice way of kind of migrating and moving SQL from AVS into like a SQL managed instance running in Azure, and basically claim back some of the nodes that are probably like they're paying for, and maybe shrinking, let's say, as an example I gave me, from 60 nodes back to, let's say, 50 nodes. So, I mean, this is a lot of money, and you can see, like, if you do the calculation of the math, how much money the customer can save by just maybe shrinking their nodes if they're just using them for storage, for example, or for SQL or for file servers as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. I know we're running a little bit over on our normal. We try to keep it to 60 minutes, but it's been such a good conversation. I want to go ahead and welcome Matt back, as well as welcome Dan to the show. Dan has been watching the Q&A as well as the comments in the background. And Dan, maybe you can share with us any of the interesting comments you've seen and or questions that have come up from the audience.
Yeah, sure. We had one interesting question around the cost of multi-cloud. And I think it's a good place to start, kind of hearkening back to an earlier part of the discussion. It just really at a high simplistic level, how cost effective is multi-cloud? And another second part to this question was, isn't it more expensive to communicate between clouds or even hybrid clouds? So I think if we could shed some light and clarify those points, that would be great.
Yeah, sorry, I was going to start on this one because I'm going to go back to my EUC background here, which is like, wasn't it more expensive to have a mobile phone and an iPad and a laptop? Yeah, like this is this is greater complexity, more administration. So the multi-cloud also is that. And I think if anybody had the perfect choice to say, you know what, let's just isolate down to the simplest infrastructure possible, then they would. But the reality is the entropy in the system for environments this is not the reality that customers are dealing with. They are dealing with this complex area. So does it cost more? Yes, because you've got to have more skill sets, right, that you've got to employ. Now, the key is this is true for everybody, right? Because everybody is dealing with the same situation. So then it's a matter of this part two of optimizing that infrastructure to be a competitive differentiator. And that's not easy. That's part of the, Matt saying you got to get comfortable being uncomfortable. So that's kind of how I would take that question. But, Matt, Husam, jump in. Oh, Matt, you're muted.
Thanks.
No worries.
Thanks for the catch.
Yeah.
It is relative. So, what I would say is it's not uncommon to work with customers that are over-architected on-prem for various reasons. One is, you buy on-prem infrastructure for, 5 to 10, but some people up to 7 years, they'll squeeze as much life out of that hardware as possible. And so that's a long time to invest, whereas cloud is more on demand. And so what we often find is we can get by with a smaller footprint because we don't have to rely on a vendor to get us a box within, sometimes it takes weeks or months. So while it is more expensive in some areas, sometimes we can recoup costs in other areas to get the capabilities you want. And we have cloud economists staffed here at VMware that help you through that to understand, maybe it is a little bit more, but here's what you get out of that benefit. Or maybe here's where you could actually move funds around and keep costs the same or even save some costs to get the benefits you want. So there is a wide range. There's not, just like multi-cloud's going to mean different things to different people. Hybrid cloud's going to mean different things to different people. I wouldn't always assume it is just flat out more expensive. I think in general, you could maybe make that assumption, but definitely start doing the work, put pencil to paper, and then you'll get your answers.
Yeah, and I can also add to that. I mean, if you step back just one step and think about why the whole multi-cloud approach is. I mean, probably the main reason that you can think of is resiliency, and resiliency eventually comes up with a cost. I mean, if you're looking for an application to be 100% of time available, something happened to this cloud provider or to on-premises, the other provider can pick it up and fail over to it. It's not going to eventually be free, right? So this is kind of the tax of having that resiliency. And we also, as customers, need to think about one thing: is what's the cost of not having that? What's the cost of my application going down maybe for 3 hours? Am I using my customers? Am I using my reputation? So this also brings another kind of point of view of how you look at the cost. Sometimes you think I'm overpaying for things, but at the same time, it could be not.
Yeah. And there can be, one other thought. It's funny, as we're having this great discussion, when Dan and I first kind of set out this topic of workload, tackling the workload placement question, which was coming up with customers, we said, we can just kind of advance the conversation in it because we don't have answers to all of these questions. This is it's not easy, right? Trying to administer and optimize these multi-cloud environments. But thinking about the more, the higher cost, right? And long-term operating costs, well, there may be, immediate gains to that. So I'll make this up. Matt, you mentioned that in one case, it can take, weeks or months or, maybe even longer when there are supply chain problems to get a switch in to enable some capability that the business needs. Well, if it costs more, again, I'm making this up, to do it in the cloud, but you can do it tomorrow versus 2 quarters from now, and that's 6 months of revenue at X million dollars. Well, hey, it costs more, but we made more money too. So from an ROI standpoint, it made sense. And these kinds of discussions / things are happening in real life, in real time, on an ongoing basis. So these are, important considerations and but no simple answers to them.
Yeah. Now, I mean, the chipset matters too. Like, I mean, depending on the chipsets you're looking at, you could be looking at a very long extended lead time, and that can have huge impacts on the business.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, we've certainly seen that in the server market and GPUs, especially today.
Yes.
So Husam, next question I'll throw at you. You talked about using a database service as part of a modernization effort. Can you bring up a couple more examples, and I'm kind of summarizing the question here, of other past services that might be useful in a modernization effort for somebody that's running in a hybrid cloud infrastructure like AVS?
Yeah, so I maybe also start answering this question by saying why I chose the database as an example, because it's a storage-intensive workload. So the other example I can bring as well is file share servers running on AVS. So we're trying to kind of move those storage-intensive workloads to some modern services that are also managed services that can be better to run if they are actually more on the PaaS side of the house on Azure. So Azure SQL Managed Instances is one of the answers for the SQL migration into Azure. We also have the other like open source databases as like MySQL, Postgres, all that is also available in Azure that can be used to modernize the database and move them into Azure Managed Services. So it's not only SQL Managed Instance from that perspective. And then also from the perspective of file servers, we have Azure Storage Files. We have even Azure NetApp Files as a good options for migrating those storage-intensive workloads as file shares into Azure native services. And I also want to kind of double click even on the Azure Storage Files, because Azure Storage Files integrates even with Active Directory. So if you have any permissions set on those file servers, and eventually you probably have, so it's actually going to be highly compatible whenever you move them into the Azure native service, in this case, the Azure Storage Files. So you're not basically taking any risk. Your things are staying persistent as they are running on AVS. What you're gaining there is basically the manageability side of the house. Operations, it's a managed service, and you also gain cost because AVS is also not cheap. So if you can get some of these workloads out of AVS and run them on the Azure native services without have to worry much about refactoring or changing your architecture, this will be really kind of a good fit. And there's also other kind of services as well you can take advantage in Azure. I mean, you can use, for example, some of the day 2 operation services. I think Matt even linked to one of those, like the log analytics or the Microsoft Sentinel as your like SIEM solution. Like you can take advantage of those solutions. You can use it even like things like Key Vault to store your keys and secrets and private keys eventually into Azure, as an Azure service, even using things like Azure Automation. There's a lot of them actually, and I personally lean toward the services that has something called private endpoint. This is very critical into Azure. If there's a service that has a private endpoint in Azure, what that means, you're communicating with the service internally in Azure. That service actually will have a private IP address. For example, that Azure Storage Files will have a private IP address in Azure. So when you're communicating from your AVS private cloud, it's an internal communication, never traverse the internet. So this is, I think, a big concern for some of the integration there, because you want to keep it private and internal as much as you can.
Yeah, lots of good info there, Husam. I think at this point, because we're about 14 minutes over, we'll probably have to cut the Q&A. Dan, appreciate you though keeping an eye on
let's
it.
Do it.
This is all the Q&A is through LinkedIn, so everyone should have the ability to contact Husam, myself, Matt, Dan, and I'm sure any messages we get, we're happy to respond to. So with that, I want to thank both of you for kind of advancing this conversation, this complex conversation on workload placement and the considerations. So look forward to having you guys both on the show again, as we've only scratched the surface of this particular topic. So thank you, Husam. Thank you, Matt. And thank you, Dan.
Yeah, thanks you, Alexander, and the team for having us. Thank you. Have a great day.
Yeah. All right. Let's go ahead and wrap this up. Episode number 11. Boy, well, the recap, right? We started out at the very high level thinking about workload placement. And when we say workload placement, really thinking about the optimization of that. Now, optimizing that means defining what good looks like for that particular application or that workload. And that can have many different criteria of considerations, which we went through. Anything from cost, if cost is what we're focusing on, or privacy or performance, right? Those are just a couple of the buckets. But thinking about what you have, as well as what good looks like for what you have, and then where it can be placed. And that kind of led into making sure that you don't get stuck in a technology silo, right? Where you don't have an awareness of what's available in the rest of the infrastructure and where things could run more efficiently, right? And by efficiently, again, to generate that business outcome that you're looking for. And we gave a couple of examples of where you can do not only a hybrid example of using a hybrid cloud, as well as platform as a service example, and then also on-prem. So with that, I want to thank everybody for watching. Our next episode is going to be live from Barcelona Explore. So the time zone will be a little bit different on that particular episode. That will be in 2 weeks. If you're going to be at Explore in Barcelona, by all means, I'll be there. Please come say hello, and always happy to answer any questions or participate through the comment section on LinkedIn, or send me a note. Also happy to answer or direct you towards any answers that I can come up with. So with that, thank you again for sticking with us through episode number 11. And I hope everyone has a wonderful, great day. Take care.